For the last time ever, let's talk about the best spotlight caches to open in Marvel Snap. But before we jump into that, there is one very important rule to keep in mind, and it is that the basic rule of whether or not a spotlight cache is worth opening going into the new system with the conversion ratio of spotlight keys to 3,000 tokens is that if there are 2 Series 5 cards you want in the cache, it can still be worth opening. But if there are less than that, you might want to think very hard before doing so. With that in mind, let's jump into the actual cards you'll be looking for. We'll be starting with what's in the Spotlight cache as of right now. This is Kahori. It's a card I was very excited for, a 4/6 with an on-reveal ability that distributes whatever the amount of cards in your hand is worth of power to your board. I think this is a card that has a lot of potential. We'll obviously know a little bit more about exactly how good it is in a day or two, but to me, this was one of my most excited for cards of the season. I felt like this card could be a Gwenpool with upside kind of level of power. I felt like it would want to be in a metagame that is full of cards that put cards in your hand, which we currently are in. I feel like it maybe makes a ton of sense in Thanos. It maybe makes a ton of sense in Misery decks with Victoria hand, and it might actually be good enough to supplant Gwenpool in some of the decks that she goes in. The major advantages of this card over Gwenpool are that it affects the board, making it a more playable card on turn 6, and that it's going to be a little bit more guaranteed impact than Gwenpool, because I think anyone who's played Gwenpool knows sometimes you just aren't playing all the cards that get the buffs, whereas this is actually distributing them to the board. Downsides include the random nature of the distribution and the amount that is distributed. It is relative to how many cards are in your hand, so this can be less guaranteed output than Gwenpool, and you definitely don't know where those points are going. So there is room for this card to lose you games or win you games, depending on dice rolls. And I do know that in my experience, Marvel Snap players drastically prefer the versions of cards that allow them to plan out as opposed to the ones that have some dice rolls in them. I remember Cersei was a card that got pretty underrated for a while, even back when it was a good option because of the random nature of it. I do think that it's possible Kahori falls into the same hole, where it's like a pretty good card, but it's not actually going to feel that way all of the time. I personally am fairly optimistic for this card, but as always, right now there is an OTA in 2 days. You're watching this video on a Tuesday, probably. So this is your warning to take stock. Make sure you aren't rushing into purchases because the bar to purchase one of these cards is higher now. You should not, I'm genuinely straight up, the best thing for someone in my position with all of the cards to do, assuming an April 29th kind of release, is probably to wait on all of them. Because if on April 29th, the new system comes out, I'll be able to pick up all of these cards for 5,000 tokens, which is the equivalent of a little under 2 keys each card, right? I'll be able to basically guarantee, because these are the only cards in the game I'm missing, that I will be spending 5,000 tokens, a little under 2 keys on each of these cards. We don't know if it's actually 5,000 tokens, but I'd be pretty shocked if it's like much higher than that, because we know it can't be 6,000 tokens, and it probably isn't 4,000 tokens, because that would be a huge discount. So we're ballparking it around 5K, 5.5K, 4.5K, something like that. That's what it feels like the new Series 5 packs have to cost. But even if they cost 6,000, again, that would be me locking in 2-keying every single one of these cards. And I would do that in a second, because I don't get anything out of anything else in all of these spotlight caches. So if you have all the cards, technically the smart thing to do is just to wait until the new system comes out. And the only thing stopping me from doing that is the fact that I'm a content creator and the fact that maybe it might not come out on April 29th. Maybe it'll come out on June 3rd, and then I'll be screwed because I won't be able to go back and get these. Or maybe I will, but I'll have to wait for them to rotate into the 4,000 pack or just a whole bunch of stuff. It does sort of raise the bar for what a purchase is, though, because if I'm not one keying this, I am losing value. Like, that's fundamentally where I'm at, is under the new system, if I'm not, I can get this card for at minimum 2 keys, probably for 5,000, 4,500, 5,500 tokens out of the new Series 5 pack. Whatever that number ends up being, it's less than 2 keys. So if I'm spending 2 keys or more on these cards, I'm losing out on value going into the new system. Now, that's not true for everybody, right? Remember that there are still people out there. I got to get out of this elitist mindset where I'm talking only to the people in my situation where I have all the cards and I could never, ever empathize with anyone else who doesn't. There are plenty of people who don't have these cards, and in those cases, it can be very much worth it. It just has to actually be worth it, right? Like, it has to be genuinely worth it for you to pick up these cards. They have to be cards that you would be willing to spend up to 6,000 on in the new system. And looking at that, I don't think Cull Obsidian is ever really going to get close to that level. I think he's like a very solid card, but this is a Series 4, right? Like, this is not a card that justifies a massive expenditure, and right now you kind of have to look at all of this stuff as a massive expenditure. One of the ways in which it is always good to open your Spotlight caches is a world where you don't have any of these cards, right? If you don't have any of these cards, these are actually good cards to pick up. In my humble opinion, this is one of the better Spotlight caches because of that. I think Kahori is good. I think Cull Obsidian is good. I think Hydra Bob, which is the last card on this cache, is also good. But what the introduction of the new system has done is forced me to get a little bit more stringent with whether or not this is actually worth doing. And the more I look at these, the more I'm like, would I rather have this card for the price of 1 key, which is 3,000 tokens, or would I rather take that 3,000 tokens and get literally any Series 4 card in the game under the new system? And that's how you have to be thinking about this, because every key you spend is any Series 4 card or half of a Series 5 card. Any Series 5 card. So the bar, I feel like, for what you have to do to justify spending gets so much higher. Cull Obsidian is a solid card. He will always have a home in various Surtur decks. He will almost always have a home, at least on the fringes, in some Thanos and some Zoo decks, but he will be far from required in those. His basic meta share is typically correlated with how good Surtur is and how often people are playing the card Surtur and the card Scar. That's what this card is. It is one of the 410s that goes in that package. It is typically one of the easier ones to justify, but with the loss of its interaction with Sam Wilson, this card has kind of fallen off of a cliff. If we were talking about a month ago, maybe we would have been able to say this is an absolute slam dunk pickup. I do not think that it is right now. The same, of course, applies to Hydra Bob, who, again, maybe longer than a month ago, was an absolute slam dunk pickup, but now has been supplanted in most good cards mid-range decks by Zabu. And the dynamics by which this happened are very interesting to me. Hydra Bob losing a point of power, Silver Sable losing a point of power. We went from a metagame where 1-drops could be about 5 power to a metagame where they were 4. And in a world where those cards are 4 power, it ends up being just not that much of a drop-off to play a 1-2 that has as much upside as Zabu instead. To me, that's more indicative of a problem with Zabu. That card should be a 1-1 or a 1-0, not the same cost as Iceman. I think you can clearly see a pretty big gap there. But it also does mean that Hydra Bob is a lot fringier than he used to be. At 1-4, there are reasonable replacements for this card. The card still has a lot of upside. It's a card that you can use to fill up lanes and then snap out of them. It's a card that you can use to get power into all locations that are off. But I do think that this is actually a very high skill cap card. It's hard in a way that a lot of other cards are not, because of the way it makes you think about using your snap as a resource. It can have interesting and intricate snap dynamics because of that. Maybe you don't want to use your snap early despite being in a dominant position, so you can use it to get this guy into a Sanctum Sanctorum later. There's just kind of a lot to actually think about when it comes to this card. I don't think he's the greatest card for you to pick up just looking for a vanilla 1-4, because I do think the vast majority of his value comes from this interaction with the snap mechanic that is so awkward and weird. I enjoy playing Hydra Bob like that because I'm not an aggressive snapper, which means that he gives me I'm very good at using my snap as a resource because I haven't used it already. That's kind of my thing with Hydra Bob. But as far as this card goes, I do not think, again, that it measures up to the standards that we have to judge these cards by. Is this gonna be better? Am I willing to use the equivalent of 3,000 tokens, which again, any Series 4 card in the game, half of any Series 5 card in the game, I don't think he reaches that level. If you're missing all three of these cards, I think then maybe you start to get into a space where this is worthwhile. Because even if you open all of them, it's probably still a reasonable deal. But you are going to be losing out most likely on the ability to target specific cards under the new system if you're using them on these caches. Next up is Infinity Ultron, a 5/6 that adds Ultron Infinity Stones to hand. I've already gone through all the Ultron Infinity Stones in a previous video, which I will link in the description if you want to take a look at an in-depth breakdown of that card. But I will say the quick and dirty TLDR is that I am a lot lower on this card than a lot of other people are. I think it'll require a lot of work to make it a worthwhile thing worth doing. I think the best case for this card is often playing it on turn 4 rather than turn 5. I think that means that I'll be wanting to play it with Luna Snow, and I think that that does not make me overexcited about what this card can do. I am generally looking at this card and thinking it is slightly underpowered while being extremely cool. If I were to compare it to something like Agamotto, I would say it is lower than that. And I think that that is fundamentally the comparison it's going to have to make in order to be a metagame relevant card. This feels like a card that is exciting and cool and unique and can do cool stuff, but you're really going to want to get it out earlier than turn 3. This is also earlier than turn 5, I should say. I'm doing the Monty Python thing where I mix up 5 and 3. 1, 2, 5. Anyway, this is a card that is going to want to be in a deck that is also doing something else, because I think so few of the combinations of stones are all that powerful. All of the stones that I think are really good basically key off of doubling this guy's power. So the Power Stone for Ultron doubles his power. That's the one I think is like, wow, that's actually really good because it goes with the stones that like move something to Ultron's location where his power has just doubled, or the stone that makes a drone and copies Ultron's power where it has just doubled. That one seems really, really good to me. Like, that's a really powerful play pattern, but you're not getting it all the time. In fact, you're not getting it most of the time because you're only getting 2 stones. When you get those stones, it seems like a really powerful thing to do, but since you're not getting them all the time, I worry that there's just too much variance inherent in this and that this is a 5/6. And that is ultimately just not a good spot to be unless you're getting it out much earlier, which is sort of why I'm thinking about the Luna Snow type of thing that this card could do. But even that comparison, when you really get down to it, like, okay, you're playing a 3/6 to play a 5/6, and it's like they have the same power. So this card is really going to need to make up not just like the difference in power between it and every other 5-drop, but also the difference in power between the stones in every 6-drop. And it just feels like it's going to fall just a little bit short on both of those cases. I realize there's a lot of people who are super high on this card, but I do think it very much is like, if I'm not getting this out on 4, I'm probably not getting everything I want out of actually playing this. I do have some worries about this guy actually hitting. Cannonball is and has been a genuinely good card. This is a card that is a very powerful finisher in decks that are able to clog you up in any kind of way. It goes in Scream decks as a very powerful top-end card. It goes in the various clog decks as a very powerful top-end card. And if the Datamined Mercury is accurate, it will be getting a big helper pretty soon. But important note, this card is Series 4. Not only is this card Series 4, but so is the other card in this cache as well, which means one keying them needs to be something that you actively want. You need to be like, I want Cannonball. I need Cannonball. I currently don't own Cannonball to make opening this cache good relative to saving your key and getting 3,000 tokens and getting any card. If you already own Cannonball, just this card being Series 4 means that in effect, by opening this cache, you are opting into getting a variant for 3,000 tokens. 3,000 tokens is extremely too much to spend on a variant, in my humble opinion. If you're trying to optimize for collection completeness, that's a very bad thing to do. Are you willing to sacrifice half of a Series 5 card to get a variant? That is what you have to ask yourself. Because this card and Pixie, the other card in the cache, are 3,000 tokens under the new system, I think that makes it very hard to justify opening for Infinity Ultron unless he is an absolute monster banger, and I am dead wrong about all of my concerns about his timing and general 5/6-ness. Cannonball is excellent. So if you are missing this and you are missing Pixie, this is one of the single best Series 4 cards in the game. I cannot make any statements other than that regarding this card's power. Pixie just got a buff, but she's not really that good yet. I think she could very easily stand to be a 2/3 or even maybe a 1/1, but I don't think that's the kind of thing that a lot of people would enjoy. I think that it would just sort of create like a sort of Mr. Negative deck that is not very fun to play against, basically. So I understand why they're being cautious with Pixie. I think play pattern concerns are real with this card. But it does sort of mean that this is just generally not the greatest card in the world. She's going to be like a pretty medium addition to any collection. And again, when we're talking about using a full key on a card that is a pretty medium addition to any collection, a lot of what else is in the cache is going to really need to pull that slack, right? Cannonball is amazing, but he is Series 4. Pixie, not amazing, is also Series 4. Infinity Ultron, we'll have to see. I'm not super optimistic on that. So when you look at the total token value of this Spotlight cache, it does end up being a little bit less. Infinity Ultron at 6,000, these two at 3,000, and then of course the random one, which I'm going to value at 2,000, because if it's one of the ones you already have, that's how many you're getting back on the duplicate. Meaning this is like a 14,000 token cache at best. If you don't own any of these cards, you are spending 12,000 tokens to get 14,000. That's a pretty okay deal. If you own a single one of these cards, you are spending, if you 4-key this, 12,000 tokens to get 11,000 of them. And then suddenly you're looking at like deeply negative value once we transition to the new system. Strange Supreme, a 2/2 that has an end of turn ability that merges a created card into him, and he gains +2 power every time it happens. I'm fairly optimistic for this card, although I do think he's a little pigeonholed, right? Like, this is a card that, to my mind, is strong, but also kind of only goes in one deck, and that is the sort of Mockingbird, Sasquatch, semi-clog deck that exists around the fringes of most metagames. It's never particularly a bad deck, and getting a card like this could supercharge it, but there are some things to worry about. First off, this card does seem very strong to me. Like, just playing this with a Squirrel Girl, eating the squirrels every so often, or even a Mysterio and eating the Mysterio clones for +2, that's not all that bad. That's basically like a pretty solid card that you're very happy to use, because not only is it scaling upwards and using these cards, it is also going to be able to unclog you in a deck that genuinely does worry pretty heavily about board space. It could also make sense in various Thanos versions, although not the currently popular ongoing Thanos, which actually wants the stones to exist. It also sort of depends on how they define created cards here. Is this a card that cares about created in hand, the way something like Victoria Hand does, or is this a card that cares about all created cards like Quinjet? I would bet that it's the second, but I do think we kind of have to ask that question. Maybe they just didn't have enough room in the text box. This is a card that I think probably does not go into Arishem. My instinct is that Arishem is not particularly interested in playing the created cards that it creates. It's a deck that is built around accelerating into 6 drops on 5 and 4 drops on 3 and scaling off of those. It'll play the created cards if it has to, but also sometimes those created cards have abilities that you actually need to have around. Not always, but I do worry that this card will not be enough payoff for what is otherwise going to be a pretty reasonable thing to do. Like, let's say you get a claw off of your Arishem generation and this guy eats it. End of the world. But even beyond that, when he's doing good things like eating a white tiger or whatever, he might just eat the tiger and then it goes into the wrong location. Like, what this guy does is make some of your positioning opaque in an RSM deck. So I'm not particularly optimistic for him unless you are able to utilize that offensively against your opponent, as opposed to being caught off guard by like, Strange Supreme ate the wrong card. Guess I lose because now I have too much power in the Strange Supreme lane and they targeted the other two. Speed is a perfectly fine card. There's really nothing bad to say about him other than that he is one of the sort of tier 2 3-drops where like right now we have a 3-drop suite that is dominated by like Rocket and Groot and Copycat and things like that. And Speed ends up falling into the tier just below that where he requires more of you than those cards do. Although his output is similar, he is asking you to do more to get that level of output, which is to say that he is just as good as those cards some of the time, but not all of the time. A lot of the time, those cards are going to be typically a little bit better because they are asking less of you. They are more generically applicable because they are asking less of you, and the output ends up being fairly similar. That said, this is still a card that is, if you look at what it does, on a metagame power level of strength. This is a card that is absolutely getting, when you do what he's asking you to do, an incredible amount of power for a 3-drop. It's a very strong card, and I do think that it isn't necessarily a huge knock against it, that the other cards aren't necessarily stronger, they're just more generically applicable, because it doesn't matter what your deck is doing. You aren't asked to do a lot to play a Rocket and Groot. You aren't asked to do a lot to play something like a Copycat, but Speed is asking things of you, and the fact that he's comparable on power level to those cards is a credit to him. In other words, this is a card that I think is maybe a little underrated or overshadowed by the incredible power of what we have at the top end of 3 right now, but it is definitely a card that I consider worth owning, especially if you're trying to like hook into various ongoing things. One thing that has been pushing Speed downwards is a general lack of Wiccan decks recently. They have been in awkward situations. He's a very good card in those lists for very obvious reasons, but typically he has, even in those lists, been pushed out by the more generically applicable Copycat and Rocket and Groot. So I would keep an eye on that. U.S. Agent. This is a pretty solid card. And I think that this is just a very important card for any of the decks that he's in, although he's much less important depending on metagame. I still like him in various versions of the Afflict deck. I've seen people running him in Surfer. He's a pretty specific card, though. This isn't a card where it's like, oh, I'm going to run him everywhere. This is not Rocket and Groot and Copycat, to use an example we just talked about. This is a card that goes in specific decks that are able to either obviate his requirements by not playing anything that actually gets hit by him, like Silver Surfer, and that is like kind of fringy in Silver Surfer. I don't want to make it seem like that's like the meta choice. It's like a fringe option that you can do. Or as a very powerful card in Ajax decks. And this is a card that gets better the bigger the metagame is in terms of numbers. It's a card that was really happy when Doom 2099 and Doom, of course, normal Doom were everywhere. That is less of what's happening right now. It is not a metagame that is super heavy on that at the current time. And so this guy is not necessarily bad, but like definitely worse than he is at his peak right now. But I do think it's worth pointing out that this has been one of the best cards in the game before, and it's sort of a metagame dependent thing about how good he is, how many targets he has, but I think this is a very solid card. In terms of this whole cache, there are 3 Series 5 cards in this cache, and that means that if you do not have 2 of these Series 5 cards, and you want 2 of these Series 5 cards, this is actually a pretty okay cache to open, even under the strictures of the rules that I've applied going into the new system. Here's where we get weird. This is a cache that is data mined for April 30th. If the new system starts, there will be no need for this if they make that April 29th deadline. This Spotlight cache will simply cease to exist, and Hydra Stomper will become the first card available in the new Snap Pack system. In case that doesn't happen, I'm going to take a look at his cache regardless, but we're going to spend a little bit less time on him because, foolishly perhaps, I believe they're going to hit that deadline. Hydra Stomper himself, I think, is a very interesting card. A 3-2 that scales for every time a card that you have has moved this game has 2 really obvious hooks. Really obvious hook number 1 is, of course, Sam Wilson. Sorry, I had to say it. It's true. Really obvious hook number 2 is Heimdall. And some combination of Sam Wilson and Heimdall could get this guy to genuinely massive numbers. I think this is a card that could be extremely strong with extremely high numbers. Downsides, it's an ongoing card. We have a million different ways to counter that. And Heimdall, the classic Heimdall into lose game plan, is very real. But if this guy can get to like 10, 11, 12, suddenly it's one of the biggest possible 3-drops you can play. Even just a Sam Wilson will add enough moves that it's not embarrassing. Sam Wilson and a Heimdall could get him into really unprecedented levels of power for a 3-drop. This card could be legit awesome. That's not even getting into like, what if we try to bring back Silk? Downsides, of course. If you are moving stuff around and you are going to be like a Silk gamer, you're going to get absolutely run over by anyone playing Scream. It's going to be extremely unpleasant. You're going to feel very, very bad. That's sort of why I was focused more on the Heimdall for a burst of power, because Scream isn't hitting that every turn. Whereas in the case of something like, a Sam Wilson, it's taking your +3 scaling, like moving it to Sam Wilson, getting +2, and then also getting +1 on this, and it's turning it into only getting +1 scaling, which is a very awkward spot to be in. Maybe you could argue it's turning it into like getting -1 scaling because they're afflicting you -2 and they're gaining 2. It means that you need to be moving a lot in order to actually justify this. Like if you're getting multiple moves per turn, then maybe you can outscale a Scream, but it does feel like this card could put you in some awkward positions in terms of counterplay, and we all know how hard it is to like get a card off the ground early in a Marvel Snap metagame. Now, what if we just play this in Scream with our Sam Wilson that we're already playing and our Craven and our, maybe we put a Heimdall in Scream? What if we just like minimize it? Then I think we might be onto something. We could be the Hydra Stomper deck that beats the other Hydra Stomper decks. It's a good spot to be on week 1. The other 2 cards in this cache are Aranya and Madam Web, and I'm going to talk about them at the same time because they go in basically the same decks. These are for dedicated move decks. It could be worth doing if a dedicated move deck ends up being good. If Hydra Stomper is actually great at being this kind of thing and it like is worth doing and you're just like doing super dedicated move deck stuff, or maybe Hydra Stomper goes in move bounce, right? Like maybe you're just interested in having a 3 whatever or something. I don't know. Again, I kind of doubt it, but I don't know. If that is happening, then you are extremely interested in opening this cache because those 2 cards will probably be in it. What I'm worried about is maybe Hydra Stomper goes into like a Scream deck instead, or like a normal mid-range deck that's sort of minimizing the package of investment. And then you have 2 cards in this cache that, while they are both Series 5 and they have both been very metagame playable before, are very hyper-specific to a very specific archetype. And so if you're not going to play that full archetype, or you don't have the other cards for that archetype, it could be a really questionable decision as to whether or not you want to open it. All right, y'all, thank you so much for watching. I'm a little worried that I probably harped too much on the potential for the system to change, in the sense of like, okay, so I'm expecting these numbers to like be a certain amount of things, or I keep repeating myself talking about like how bad it can be to open caches under the current system going into the new system. The reason I harped on that so much is people keep asking me, are these caches worth it going into the new system? The hard and fast rule is, are there 2 Series 5 cards that you want in the cache? If so, go ahead and open it. If not, don't. And I think that it's worth pointing out that for everyone who's in my position and has all the stuff, it is overwhelmingly likely to be better value to just wait for the new system to hit. The problem is we don't know if it's going to hit by the 29th or the 3rd. If it hits by the 29th, waiting is going to feel really smart because you spent less to get these resources than everyone else. But if it hits by the June 3rd, then waiting is going to feel really stupid because you won't be able to go back in time and actually get Kahori and get these cards that are coming out right now. And I think, I originally thought that they put the 29th and the 3rd as potential dates because they genuinely weren't sure which one it was going to hit. But now I'm kind of looking at it and I'm like, man, there's kind of financial upside for them there, isn't there? Because now I feel like if I don't get them now and they miss the deadline, I'm going to feel really dumb. But if I do get them now and they hit the deadline, then I'm going to feel dumb the other way. And so I'm going to default to getting them now. They got my ass. I'm getting them. I'm not waiting. I mean, I'd be doing it anyway. I'm a content creator. But like, if I wasn't, I'd be really thinking about this, you know? And it's like, oh, okay. I mean, I guess. I don't want to say that they did it because of the financial upside. I don't think that's true. But it is like, oh, I did notice that not knowing when this system is going to hit does make it harder to make my decisions. And that is definitely real. All right, y'all. I've been KMBest. You have been phenomenal. And I will see you in the next one.